Well, thanks for coming, and this is just one of about 60 stops on a national tour that we're doing on the occasion of the publication of the paperback edition of this book. We are near the tail end of a month of travel, and so I probably am showing the wear and tear. Amy is much more resilient and tireless, and I'm honored to be here working with her. We got up at, I think, at about 3 a.m. after a late event with KPFK last night to produce the show this morning. But it's always great to be here in L.A.
Isn't it dinner time now?
Yeah, it's great to be here in L.A. and Skylight Books as well. I think the genesis was, Amy was invited to be on Bill Maher a few years ago, and on these tours you have to be constantly working, and Amy insists on constantly working. So it's my task to help find things to do, and I'm like, well, we can't do a book event on Friday night because of the TV show, but maybe we could do something midday. And Skylight Books was very amenable to doing something at noon, and as you all can see yourselves, it's a great opportunity to bring people together, and that's really what I think part of the book is. It's a tool for bringing people together. We use it for fundraisers for stations like KPFK around the country, and it also is a document that we hope serves to explain the work that we do, share the stories that we try to cover every day, and that's really as embedded in the subtitle, Covering the Movements Changing America, about social movements, about actual news, not the fake news and not So speaking of fake news, as Amy mentioned earlier when she was just speaking with KPFK's Jerry Quickly, they actually did a recording of about a 20-minute interview earlier in the hour here. The LA Weekly is furthering a false news story that I'm married to Amy Goodman. I have a very understanding wife in Colorado, and Amy was at my wedding, but we're not married. And my wife actually does refer to her as my work wife. So I guess, but it's such a trivial detail, and I only mention that because the guy. Who went and gave this event a nice listing in the LA Weekly said it had no mention of our marital status in the listing that he submitted to the editors. So someone went through the extra mile late at night to insert that.
Skylight Books in the LA Weekly.
Yes. So anyway, it's. But to travel with Amy, to work with Amy, it's been a real life-changing experience for me. And just very briefly, I started listening to the show on its first summer of broadcast in 1996. I was living on an island owned by the family of Buckminster Fuller off the coast of Maine as a caretaker, and commuted to shore for groceries and the like with a sea kayak. It was about 6 miles, and another 3 miles to another island for the access to a payphone. So didn't have anything digital or anything, but did have a radio, access to one of the first 9 stations that carried Democracy Now! In that first year of broadcast, WERU out of Blue Hill, Maine. And that gave me a glimpse into the wider world, connection to the news that's so vital for an engaged person. And after that, continued following the show in 1990. It kind of led to, as I think it does for many people, an inspiration to get more involved with activism, and joined a group that was organizing a shutdown of the WTO meeting in Seattle in 1999. That protest was ultimately successful in shutting down the meeting. It was kind of going to be the capstone of Bill Clinton's kind of corporate globalization crusade in the 90s, and the WTO meeting in Seattle was the focus of a major protest. And there was, in that nonviolent direct action, and it was kind of set the stage for the 2000 Democratic National Convention here in L.A., where you saw a lot of the same people and a lot of the same tactics aimed at challenging the corporate power structure. that protest, there were a lot of working groups in the organizational structure, and the blockades, the recon, the jail support, all the different interesting facets of a major protest. No one wanted to join the working group on mainstream media outreach and public press relations. So I joined that very unpopular working group and ended up kind of basically confirming the suspicion that the corporate media was going to do a horrible job covering the protest, focusing on some of the sensational aspects of it, some of the property damage, ignoring the police violence by and large, and just harping on the impact on Christmas sales and things like that. So the protest was dismally covered in the corporate press, but it juxtaposed that with the independent media that was emerging in the kind of the web 1.0. Indiemedia.org was a website that was set up specifically to provide alternative news coverage to the WTO protest, and it got more hits during the week of protest than CNN.com. And then you had programs like Democracy Now!, and it was at the Independent Media Center that was set up in Seattle in 1999 to cover the protests, where I met Amy and Juan and Jeremy Scahill, and they did such exemplary work during that week of protests, and really it was a... I continued with that trajectory, was helping someone deemed a political prisoner by Amnesty International. To this day, I noticed there were some folks canvassing for amnesty outside, and Amnesty has identified Leonard Peltier as a political prisoner, an American Indian Movement member who's been in prison for now over 40 years. And there was a big campaign in the late 90s to gain executive clemency from Bill Clinton for him, and Clinton famously abused his power of executive clemency and also ignored Peltier's very well-supported, globally supported appeal for that release from prison. So after that campaign, and after Clinton left office, the folks running the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee in Lawrence, Kansas, were a very small group of dedicated activists and needed and deserved a break. And so I went out to Lawrence to help keep the Peltier Defense Committee active and going for about 6 months, during which time I had a daily phone call with Leonard every morning and would visit him in the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary every week. And we were kind of keeping, the strategy, shifting gears, moving forward into, what does a political prisoner do to help shepherd his freedom during the early days of the Bush years. And obviously, he remains there today. So it's a difficult organizing challenge. But in those phone calls that I had with Leonard, almost every day he would open up with a conversation, a question. Did you listen to Amy this morning? And that's because KKFI Community Radio in Kansas City, Missouri carries Democracy Now! It's live at 7 a.m. Central Time. And Leonard, and as he said, the brothers would circle around a small transistor radio in the prison yard and listen to that show for the full hour, and then be forced off to work in one of the prison industries throughout the day. But that connection, again, to the wider world, to the news and information provided on Democracy Now!, as Leonard told me himself, was such a vital connection to the world at large, especially those people in prison, in one of the most oppressive environments in our society, who have no access to or limited at best access to internet, and certainly needed and benefited from that community radio station and access to Democracy Now! We did a benefit a few years ago for a sister station to KPFK in Atlanta, WRFG, Radio Free Georgia. And if you've spent time in Georgia, there's not a lot of KPFK-style stations out there. So anyway, Radio Free WRFG was doing a pledge drive and told us that they had gotten a contribution. It was about a $330 contribution, which is generous on any level, but the fact that it came from 65 $5 donations from prisoners in the U.S. Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, one of the worst maximum security prisons in the country, most violent and oppressive environments. And the prisoners there 65 of them pooled their donations together and actually made a call into the pledge room from the prison to make that pledge and mailed in their money. So it was, another thanking again WRFG for their, in part, for bringing Democracy Now! through the prison walls to those that to them. And then, just 2 years ago, we got a call from a guy in the UK, I'd say probably a progressive administrator of a prison educational programs. And there he asked for permission to run Democracy Now! In its televised version. He kind of programmed a closed-circuit TV system throughout the prison, or several prisons in the UK. And so we immediately gave him unlimited permission to run the show. That's exactly the kind of free use that we hope is made of the program. And a year after he began running the show, he contacted us and said they had a 50% increase in the participation in the educational and vocational programs in the prison. And when asked, those prisoners said they did it largely because of something they had heard on Democracy Now! And so I bring this up not only because it inspires us to hear these stories and to continue the work, but also to remember that, as we do all have, what Julian Assange calls personal government tracking devices in our pocket, the cell phones with the instant access to information, we have to remember those who live on the other side of prison walls or on the other side of the digital divide or on the other side of an international border who don't have such ready access to the news and information, the culture, the programming of stations like KPFK. We're going to be distributing these flyers around. If you haven't gotten one, we're actually having some printed because we've run out. And distributing the clipboard, that's, again, an analog device. The clipboard, old school organizing tool as an old school organizer. The clipboard is our daily digest. It's an opt-in to get an email every day with our news. It's also how we contact you and a broad audience of people if we need to. There's a page or two in the book that summarizes police run-ins that Amy's had over the course of her career, and it's really only a snapshot, and it really doesn't, and it isn't to kind of celebrate or minimize such encounters. It's unfortunate that journalists have to suffer such threats just for doing this important work, and Amy has never blanched in the face. It's really, I've learned a lot from watching her deal with people who've been given, positions of authority, whether they've earned it or not, and it's usually backed up with weaponry, and she doesn't in any way shirk or is not intimidated at all by these people, and it's been really inspirational. And so that sign-up sheet, in part, allows us to have a rapid response mailing list, email list, should Amy or one of our journalists have their work intruded upon by the authorities, whether they're detained, as Amy was with Sharif Abdel-Qaddus and Nicole Salazar in 2008 in the Twin Cities covering the Republican National Convention, or beyond. So anyway, that's the clipboard, where we'll be signing books until we have to get into the famous local traffic system and make our way to Santa Barbara. We're going to do a benefit for a new low-power FM station there, KZAA, licensed to La Casa de la Raza, and also for KCSB, which I have to always trumpet was the station. It's a community college station in Santa Barbara where a young man got his start broadcasting, and he was kicked off the air for saying something considered controversial. He demanded representation by the ACLU. The ACLU defended him. He was restored to his position on the airwaves, and he went on to have what has proved to be a very lucrative career, and that was Sean Hannity. So he got his start on KCSB, and he's only maintained his tenure as a broadcaster thanks to the reviled ACLU. So we'll be doing a benefit. Despite that history, we still love KCSB, and we'll be doing that benefit tonight. So that's where we're off to next. So to tell you more, here's an esteemed colleague, my friend and work wife, Amy Goodman.
guys. This is beautiful. You know, I knew that a tree grew in Brooklyn, but I didn't realize that they're out here in California. No, actually, just the opposite. We woke up at 3 o'clock this morning, and we're over at the TV studio by, 3:30, 4. And these TV studios where we work, because we're not only on the radio on KPFK, but we're on public television all over. We're on 1,400 stations now. So we're on KCET, we're on Link TV, which it's affiliated with, on satellite TV all over the country. We're on KLCS, and by the way, which is public television here, channel 58 and 58.1. And you have flyers. For some of you who I signed the books to already, I gave you clumps of flyers. It's not because they just got clumped together. Give them out to friends. Yes, that's the old-fashioned way. Of course, post on Facebook, and everywhere else, spread through social media that Democracy Now! Exists and what they can discover. A friend here said he's been clean for 1.5 years off meth because of Democracy Now!, which deeply inspired me. I don't know. I hope that he didn't replace one addiction with another, and the other thing is, last night we spoke at the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church, as we do every year, and we were in the Unitarian Church in Burlington, Vermont, and the Presbyterian Church in Berkeley, California, and, I don't know how I end up in so many churches. I think it is because listeners and viewers always come up and say, I follow you religiously, and I got the wrong message. But I do hope you give gobs of these away. It lets people know where they can get independent media. But Skylight Books has now become a tradition, and it's like a home away from home for us to come here to be grounded in Los Angeles. And this morning when we got into the studio, it's a green screen. So you can go back and look at Democracy Now! Today at democracynow.org, and you'll see, I say, from Los Angeles, this is Democracy Now! Now, I just see green paint behind me, but you see palm trees. And so at some point in the show, the cameraman flipped the video screen so I could see myself. And I was, where are those palms? Because I just see green, but on this screen, what everyone else sees. And I haven't seen any palm trees because we haven't exactly had a little time to stop and smell the coffee at all. But it has been truly wonderful and inspiring to go around this country to meet so many people who are deeply concerned about the fate of the planet. I really do think that those who are concerned about war and peace, those who are concerned about the growing inequality between the rich and the rest of us, those who are concerned about economic and racial justice, who are concerned about LGBTQ equality, those who are concerned about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. I'm so excited to continue to be on KPFK every morning, 6. We actually broadcast at 5, but it goes on the air at 6 and 9, 90.7 FM, as well as 93.7 FM. And to be a part of this really historic institution. And I was saying to Jerry, I'm so glad Jerry's back. Last night, Sonali was part of our program. Sonali Kohatkar is back with Rising Up. This is so important to have these strong independent media institutions and the history they come out of. On Mother's Day, we're celebrating KPFA, the first Pacifica station, 1949, almost 70 years old. And it was founded by a war resistance sister named Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camps and said, there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifico was born. KPFK, 10 years later, 1959. Our station in New York, 1960, WBAI, WPFW in Washington just turned 40. And KPFT in Houston, 1970 it went on the air. And then it was blown off the air by the Ku Klux Klan. And that's what I was talking about earlier. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And it was right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. And I thought that was a good song. But so they get back on their feet, they rebuild the station, transmitters back up in a few weeks, and the Klan straps 15 times the dynamite to the transmitter, and they blow it up again. And now it's really serious. It takes many months to get back on the air. And in January of 71, Arlo Guthrie came back to Houston to finish his song live on the air. Alice's Restaurant was complete, and KPFT has been broadcasting ever since. And I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacific is, dangerous independent media is, dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is a native elder from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, or an uncle in Afghanistan, which is now experiencing the longest war in U.S. history, and President Trump promises to make it ever longer with thousands of more troops on the ground in Afghanistan. When you hear people speaking from their own experience, I'm not saying you will agree with them. How often do we agree with our family members? But it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back. So this journey has been amazing. 2 weeks ago we were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I had the great honor of doing a public interview with Noam Chomsky at the First Parish Church. And you can check out on democracynow.org that amazing event. We played it 2 days later, but also here at Skylight, we have the first interview we did with Noam, not first ever. Do you know that Noam wrote his first treatise against fascism? I think it was about the Spanish Civil War. I think in something like 38 when he was 10 years old. I just thought I'd share that with you, not to make anyone feel inadequate in any way. Okay, because I sure don't, 10 years old. So anyway, but we have this great DVD, which is the interview that Juan Gonzalez and I did with Noam just 2 weeks before when Noam was in New York. He's 88 years old right now. My Noam always makes me think family when I see him. My parents and Noam went to camp together growing up. But this interview we're making available to you if you get 2 copies of the book. And now you don't have to get any copies, although I'm sure Skylight Books would love you to get a couple copies. And we want to support these independent spaces. Skylight Books is an oasis of dissent. And dissent is what will save us. 2 copies. Why else would you get them? Father's Day is coming up, and maybe you forgot your Mother's Day gift. It's a good thing to honor your mother or the mother and someone you care about. And also did you forget to give your mother a gift? Oh, it's a very good thing to do. Oh, Grandma, yes. But that's your mother's fault, because that's your mother. Okay. It also helps it get it on the New York Times bestseller list. Now, why does that matter? I just want to talk to you about the politics of bestseller lists. If you get on a list like that, and it's pretty hard to do, the book is taken by libraries, by universities, by prisons. It's just more likely it will get out into the ether. And so many bookstores, and I can tell you this traveling around, are not like Skylight. And by the way, now I understand why it's called what it is. And before, when I was baking here, I was saying, could someone turn off the light? And I thought, suddenly I felt like Donald Trump, like turn off the sun, please. I'm sure we could do that. And then I realized, that's a Skylight, and that is the name. Okay, I get it. The New York Times bestseller list, so many bookstores are not like Skylight. They only stock the bestsellers. And many good people go into them. They don't realize that. And it is a roadmap, a book like this, to a whole other universe that ends up taking you to places like this, hearing places like KPFK and KCET, Link TV, and all the wonderful, I would not say alternative media. I would say all of this is mainstream. All of this is mainstream. Don't let them fool you when they beat the drums for war. And just so that's why it's really great to be able to get on these lists. And then there's another little thing. The Times doesn't like to talk about Democracy Now! Very much, only occasionally. Like once, Brian Stelter, who's now on CNN but was at the New York Times, he did a profile on Democracy Now! It was an amazing story, and that was wonderful. But they don't like to talk about Democracy Now! Generally. So we named the book Democracy Now!, and if it got on the list, well, it would just have to appear because of a mathematical equation, because they're not fake news, right? So they just have to report that book is there. But most importantly is that idea. Just the reason why Denis and I, not my husband, but my wonderful esteemed colleague and friend, why Denis and I write a column every week together for Hearst, for King Features, to get into what's called the mainstream newspapers and websites of this country, so that people discover you are not alone. You are not crazy. In fact, you've got so much company. The majority of people, I think, very much share your values. So what gives me that feeling, and what gives me that hope? Right before we were in Cambridge with Noam, our first stop was where Denis lives in Denver. And we did this big fundraiser for the local community radio, KGNU, for Denver Open Media, which is public access. Denver PBS also runs Democracy Now!, as does, Free Speech TV is based in Denver. And then we were doing a fundraiser as well, all these stations, and Colorado Independent, a great investigative news website in Colorado. And we were at the Su Teatro Performing Arts Center, wonderful Latino community center. And we did this event, and the next day we went over to the Unitarian Church so that I could actually meet Jeanette Vizquera. Jeanette is a Mexican immigrant. She's been here for like over 20 years, hard-working, law-abiding, mother of 4. Her oldest, she's in her 20s, and she's DACA. She's a dreamer. She can legally work, live, study here. And Jeanette got scared after Donald Trump was elected because Daniel Ramirez in Washington State was arrested. He was iced. He was picked up by ICE. Daniel was a dreamer. He was legally allowed to be here in this country. Why was he picked up? Could you imagine the chill that sends through communities of millions of people in this country? If a person who is legally allowed to stay is picked up, what happens to the 11 million undocumented in this country? Very clear message that President Trump very explicitly wants to send. In this period now, since his inauguration, far more people have been deported. And I can't tell you how much that means, because President Obama was called, even by his closest immigrant rights supporters inside and outside the White House, the deporter-in-chief. He deported millions and millions of immigrants. And Donald Trump has far surpassed him. Can you imagine the fear in so many communities? And by the way, I know some of you can imagine that fear. I'm sure there are many people here who do not have the proper papers, but who are law-abiding residents who make this place great, who make America great again. And we need a forum for everyone to talk to each other. That is the power of independent media, so we can hear each other's voices and figure out how we are all going to live on this planet, make it a better place, live in a sustainable, real way together. And so I went and saw Jeanette. And she had taken refuge in the church. It was Saturday morning, and her kids were just waking up as we were doing the interview. Roberto is coming into the room, wiping the sleep out of his eyes. He was 10 years old, a feather of a boy. He goes to the Denver Public Schools, speaks perfect English. He's an American citizen. His little sister, Zuri, is 6, and she climbs on her mother's lap. Denis is filming, and they were going off to a Cesar Chavez march that day. And Roberto was holding a sign that his teacher had made. It was a lithograph of his mother, Jeanette, of her face. Beautiful Mayan features. And in the bottom it said something like keeping families together. And he was holding this, and he had his arm around his mother. He was standing, she was sitting. And he kept tight hold of her tightly. And he said, we're going to go out to this march today. I'm going to take my little sister, but my mother can't come, because if she steps foot outside the church, she could be arrested. He said, so I am my mother's voice. So we went back to New York, and we broadcast that interview. And then the next day, Time magazine, like 2 days later, announced the 100 most important people in the world. Jeanette Vizguera was among them. And so she holds a news conference at the church. She can't step foot outside, and she's holding up her 2016 tax returns. And she says, anyone's free to see them. And I challenge the President of the United States to do the same. But in the church, she talked about the death threats against her while she was in the church. And I said, so what gives you hope? And she said, because there's so many more people, thousands of people who express their support. She reminded me of Isabel Allende, the great writer who wrote House of the Spirits and so many other wonderful books, who lives in the Bay Area, is Chilean. And she had once said, for every paramilitary death squad thug, there are thousands of compañeras and compañeros who are there to support each other, to be there for each other. That's the hope. And that's what Jeanette was saying. And she was saying, the Denver police chief told her he had her back when he heard about the death threats. Call me if there's any problem, he said. The Denver mayor has her back. The congressman from Denver, Jared Polis, has her back. It's an amazing story what's happening. The level of resistance at every level of society. Juan Gonzalez and I'm going to talk a little more about Juan in a minute. The great Juan Gonzalez, journalist from New York. We've been co-hosting together for full 21 years of Democracy Now! And Juan and I went to this meeting a couple months ago downtown Manhattan, nondescript office building. Inside, hundreds of people had gathered. Not your typical noble activists who go out onto the streets. Not that anyone is typical, but they were elected leaders from all over the country. I mean city council members, state legislators, mayors, public officials packing this room to talk about how can they provide sanctuary to the residents of their community. How can they work together to resist what's happening in Washington, D.C. today? It was absolutely amazing. Never assume someone's position based on the position that they have. It is so important to recognize this. So, for example, who is there? Gregorio Casar, who is the youngest ever Austin City Council member, who just got arrested protesting Governor Abbott's signing of the fierce anti-immigrant bill that would outlaw sanctuaries. The governor in Texas has taken on, the sheriff of Austin, Sally Hernandez, threatening to cut off funds to the Capitol. And yet people are united and they are fighting back. So last year when I was on this tour, Juan was being feted all over New York because he retired from the New York Daily News after 29 years. And as I was traveling, I was getting all these pictures of his parties. And at one of them, like the Francis Tavern is this historic tavern in downtown Manhattan, the Daily News threw this party for him. And I get a picture, Mayor de Blasio leaving the party and Governor Cuomo coming to the party. They won't be in the same room because they hate each other. And then, the Senator Chuck Schumer, and I'm going like, Ron, what did you do wrong? Like, you're not supposed to be feted by public officials. We're supposed to hold them accountable. But then I realized, no, they were coming to see with their own eyes to verify that this man who had dogged them for decades was actually, in fact, leaving the scene. But, of course, he's not, because though he left the New York Daily News, he stays with his other DN, which is Democracy Now! And he teaches at Rutgers. So, speaking of which, you have Jeanette Vizquera, who took refuge in the church. Time Gala, New York, she can't go, right, because she is going to be arrested if she steps foot outside, so the community throws a time gala for her in the church. And we showed the pictures, and the next day, that morning in Denver, ICE can't arrest her there, really. I mean, we'll see what happens in the coming months in these sanctuary churches. So the next day, they arrest Arturo Hernandez Garcia. He had taken refuge in that church 2 years before I knew him, because I went to interview him in the church under Obama, and he didn't leave till he got a Department of Homeland Security letter that said, you are not a priority for deportation. And then he felt he wanted to act in good faith, send a message to the millions of people who are undocumented to say you can come out of the shadows. He continued to work with his brother-in-law in their tile business. He was married, lived here for more than a decade with his children and his wife. And he was arrested, picked up off the street as he was heading to work. They couldn't get Jeanette, so they get Arturo. And they were both immigrants' rights activists. And so we interviewed a young woman from the AFSC named Jennifer Piper. And she called us. She said, what are you doing? He has a letter that says he's not a priority for deportation. And they said, it's a new era now, and we have no priorities. Very unusual way to put it. So Arturo's in jail. Jeanette's in the church. We were speaking at the Burlington Unitarian Church, and I saw Zuli Palacios and Kike Balcazar. They're immigrants' rights activists who are working in the dairy farms of Vermont, like 1,500 of them that supply dairy to places, companies like Ben & Jerry's, to ensure that people have fair working conditions and fair pay. And a few weeks ago, they were picked up, and they were held for almost 2 weeks. They were not deported, though their colleague was, I think because of the tremendous outcry. Does resistance make a difference? And Juan, I said, is at Rutgers, and a young woman named Karime Andujar, who is a very popular Rutgers student who is a spokesperson for Undocu Rutgers. She gets a email or call that says she has to show up for an ICE interview. She's a dreamer. Why does she have to show up? And so that sent just terror through all communities. And everyone from, from fellow students to Senator Cory Booker to the university were all up in arms about this. So Juan interviewed her last week. We played the interview the next day as she was going into the ICE interview. Is the Trump administration hunting down immigrants' rights activists? Because you hunt down someone who is more high level, what hope does anyone else have? I was talking to a Baltimore city councilman. He said in some schools, 20 to 30% of the kids are not showing up. And they're not even necessarily undocumented, but their parents are terrified that they'll be taken. And then you see the vicious cycle. Attendance drops in a school. It starts to drop in federal aid. It is this vicious cycle that undermines the most vulnerable communities in our country, and that doesn't make any of us safe. safer. When people are afraid, and this is a direct issue that you can talk to anyone across the political spectrum about, if you care about national security, you do not want a situation where a community shuts in on itself. If someone breaks into your home, you want to be able to call the police and say, please help me. But if you are afraid, you are not going to call because you're afraid they're going to arrest you. If you are a victim of domestic violence, you're going to be afraid. This doesn't make any of us safer. So, Juan, in addition to being feted all over New York, was inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame last year with, Charlie Rose and Leslie Stahl and New York Times' Max Frankel and others. But he was the first Latino journalist to be inducted. And Juan is one of the founders of the Young Lords, the sort of Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers. He led the Daily News strike many decades ago. Such an important figure around social change and important grassroots journalism in our country. As he was inducted, we all went to this Midtown Manhattan ceremony. The New York Times had a table, CBS had a table, Wall Street Journal had a table, Democracy Now! Had 2 tables. And Juan's speech put everyone else to shame. He said, I figured my modest contribution, as he talked of his quarter of a century as a columnist, my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them, not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. He said, I've tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. Juan said, I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage, hopefully, inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. And I think that philosophy, that approach very much embodies what we do at Democracy Now! And so I want to talk about the standoff at Standing Rock. Last April 1st, in North Dakota, along the Cannonball River, a woman named LaDonna Brave Bull Allard opened her home, her property, to the resistance. LaDonna Brave Bull Allard is the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux. She is a descendant of Sitting Bull. They opened her home to the resistance? Well, the resistance are the people who resist the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline that would snake its way from North Dakota, taking fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields to South Dakota through Iowa, Illinois, hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And they said no. Now, they weren't alone. The people of Bismarck, the capital, North Dakota, they said no. And this private pipeline company owned by Energy Transfer Partners, respected. People of the capital didn't want that pipeline there. And the people of Mandan, North Dakota, said no. So it wasn't put there. But the Native Americans were not so lucky. And so they began to resist. First at Sacred Stone Camp of LaDonna's. And then there were so many people coming to North Dakota that they had to open one after another of these resistance camps. Thousands of people. And it was truly amazing. It was this historic gathering, this historic largest unification of Native American tribes in decades in this country. From Latin America, from the United States, from Canada, the First Nations, and many non-Native allies. They were protesting the desecration of their sacred land and the possibility that the Missouri River, that it would tunnel under, could be polluted, could be contaminated. The Missouri River, the longest river in North America, that provides water to some 17 million people downstream. The people don't call themselves protesters. They call themselves water protectors. So thousands gathered. This was building steam. And don't forget, this is just last April, a year ago. This is all through the 2016 presidential election. Do you think in the general election debates, the moderators, I think maybe it's more accurate to call them media personalities than journalists, did one of them ask a candidate about climate change, let alone Dakota Access Pipeline, about climate change, the issue that concerns every one of us here, deeply impacts all populations all over the planet. Democracy Now! Goes to all the climate summits. We were in Copenhagen, 2009, then Cancun, then Durban, then Doha, then Poland, then Peru, then Paris. And the reason we go is because the people, not inside these halls, but outside, thousands come from the most vulnerable places on earth, like the Maldives. A 15-year-old boy in Copenhagen stares into her camera and says, "You will drown my country." The people of sub-Saharan Africa says, "You are cooking our continent." And it matters because we here in the United States are the historically greatest greenhouse gas emitter on earth. We have a responsibility. And what better time to raise that than during a presidential election that will determine who will occupy the most powerful position on earth. And so the people in North Dakota gathered, they protested, and we went there on Labor Day weekend. The team of us, Denis, John Hamilton, our videographer, and Laura Gottesdiener, our producer, who's on this wild ride of a tour across the country today. And we got there on a Friday afternoon, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. And a judge was going to rule the next week in the case of the Standing Rock Sioux versus the Justice Department. And he had asked the Standing Rock Sioux, if you say this is sacred land, you got to give me a map that shows me this, that proves this. So they made a map for him, and he gave it over to Energy Transfer Partners. When we got there, these protests, how to describe them to you, people walking down the back rural roads, prairie roads of North Dakota, hundreds of people. They often start with a water ceremony. Then they'll hold up a glass of water, and they are met by a fully militarized sheriff's department. They have MRAPs and tanks. They're hit by massive amounts of tear gas. They're arrested. You have the Native elders, the women, holding up water and saying, "This is for you, not just for us. This is to protect your children, not just ours. Why are you only protecting the Dakota Access Pipeline? What about us?" So we documented all of this. And on Saturday, people were going to the area they designate on the map to plant their native tribe, their native flags. And they didn't know that DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was going to be excavating that day because it was a holiday weekend. And they come up on the property, and these huge bulldozers are there. And these bulldozers had been way down the road. They believe they leapfrogged over from where they were to the site designated on the map that they designated, and the judge had given their map to the company. And they believed that the company was going to destroy the sacred mounds on the ground, that changed the facts on the ground. So next week it would be a moot point when the judge ruled. And they were furious. And it was first a woman and a child, and then more women, and then men and girls and boys all coming up on the property and saying to the bulldozers, "Go back." And more people came from the resistance camps. And do you understand how brave this is? These are massive machines that are churning the earth. To stand in front of them, it made me think back to March 16th, 2003, 3 days before the U.S. invaded Iraq. But it was another place in the Middle East. It was Rafah in Gaza. And it was a young American woman who went to Evergreen College in Olympia, where we just were last Saturday, named Rachel Corrie. And she'd gone to Gaza with International Solidarity Movement to stand in solidarity with Palestinians. And she befriended a Palestinian pharmacist family, and Israeli military brought a bulldozer in front of his house, and she stood there with other activists, and she donned one of those orange fluorescent vests that construction workers wear. And she stood in front of the bulldozer, and it crushed her to death. So that's what I thought of as I was looking at these women standing in front of the bulldozers. But this time, in North Dakota, they prevailed, and the bulldozers pulled back. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bulldozers pulling back. And it was then that the guards of the Dakota Access Pipeline unleashed attack dogs on the Native Americans. This is 2017. And the dogs were biting the water protectors, and even the dogs would pull back, and the guards would throw them into the crowd. They'd bite their way out. We interviewed people who were bitten, who were bleeding. We showed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. But the people succeeded that day, injured, wounded, but they prevailed, and the bulldozers pulled back. Even the guards left after a period. And we took this video, we posted it on Facebook. Within 24, 48 hours, there were more than 14 million views. I mean, this gives the lie to the corporate media saying, we give the people what they want, and they're not interested in those issues. You may want them to be, but they're not. Not true. If you let people know what's going on, people care. And that's why it was so important to show the images on the ground. So, we interviewed Winona LaDuke the day of the dogs. Winona, who is from the White Earth Reservation, great indigenous rights leader. When White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, she had pitched her teepee in the Red Warrior Camp. It's emblazoned with all these endangered animals around it. And she said, Governor Dalrymple, he was the governor of North Dakota, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama. This is not 1965. We are through. So we went back to New York. We continued to investigate all this. That week, President Obama was in Asia. I did that historic trip to Laos. And at the end of that trip, he held a democracy forum for young Asian students all over the region. And the last question was asked by a Malaysian young woman. And she raised her hand. She said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? No American journalist had dared to ask President Obama publicly about this epic struggle. It took this young Malaysian student who is coming to a forum to learn about democracy from the President of the United States. And President Obama held forth eloquently about the oppression of Native peoples for centuries, and then he actually kind of addressed this issue. He said, as for the Dakota Access Pipeline, I'd have to get back to my team on that, he said. He did come back to the U.S. that week, and he reportedly saw the video of the dogs. And the significance of that attack was not lost on the first African-American president of this country. So that was midweek. The end of the week, judge is going to rule on Friday. Dalrymple calls out the National Guard. And it didn't look good for the tribe. Oh, also the authorities quietly issued an arrest warrant for me, but I didn't know that at the time. So Friday at 5, the judge rules. Total routing of the tribe. Terrible decision for the tribe. Justice Department, Obama's, prevails over the tribe. But 15 minutes later, those same folks, the lawyers of the Justice Department, who were going to pop their champagne corks because they had won, an unprecedented letter came out of Justice, Interior, and the Army Corps of Engineers saying they were going to slow down. So the Justice Department trumped the Justice Department, even before Trump became president. But it was a big deal. They said they're going to slow down. They're not going to grant the permit right away. They're going to look at whether natives had input. They're going to look at whether there was an environmental impact statement. So things were looking up. And that day, that Friday, Nermeen Sheikh and I, co-host of Democracy Now!, we went to Canada. We weren't fleeing. We were invited to the Toronto International Film Festival to speak after the premiere of a film about the muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. You know, he's the one who taught young people, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And that's the name of the documentary. You should all see it. And it also features Democracy Now! And the modern-day independent media organizations. Also Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone. So Matt came up too, and we all went to Toronto. And I wanted to go because I know they care about First Nations in Canada, and I felt it was really critical to just having been there a few days before to talk about the standoff. Next day I'm speaking at University of Toronto along with my colleagues, and I'm giving a speech then, and I have this annoying habit of always checking to see what's happened, like what is Donald Trump going to say today? Did he say it? And anyway, I looked down, but this is before he was president. I looked down, and a text had just come in that said, "You're under arrest." Now, I mean, it said like, no, wait, it said there's an arrest warrant out for you. So I was speaking. Do you ever try to do this? You are speaking. You're trying to make sense, but you're also trying to figure out your whole life plan at that moment at the same time. So I was going, okay, is this a scam? And so, folks, I think, but I don't want to say anything because this is very serious. So I'm thinking, okay, arrest warrant. Is this a scam? Well, there's a North Dakota number there. Maybe it isn't. It turned out it was a North Dakota lawyer. And so I couldn't really keep operating on these 2 tracks. So I just said, could someone call me a cab? Because, you see, if there's an arrest warrant for you, I mean, it's not like you're going to be picked up automatically. But if you have interaction with the police or the FBI or border agents, and they see the arrest warrant in the system, you're going to be taken. And I have to go over the border. And I'm thinking, can they really stop me from going home? Or just take you. So if I could get to the airport without saying much of anything and get home before the arrest warrant goes into the system. And I did. Okay, so I come back to New York. I didn't take this arrest warrant personally. I really did think it was a message to all journalists. Do not come to North Dakota. Which is why we all needed to go to North Dakota. And I also wanted to send a message to young reporters, young people who wanted to document what was happening. This is epic. And I wanted to let them know. I mean, they can't afford to go to jail. They don't have the resources. They don't have the institutional backing. That you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. And so we returned to North Dakota a few weeks later. Same team, Laura, John, Denis, and I. And, we were going to call the bluff of the authorities. As we landed in Bismarck, the prosecutor announced he was going to quash the arrest warrant. He had dropped the charges. Oh, but he was going to charge me anew with more serious charges of riot, for which I faced a year in jail. Riot? I'm standing in the airport. Riot? Like I'm a one-woman riot? Move over, late-night comedians. So I call my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had a North Dakota lawyer before. And I said, I don't understand. What does this mean? And he said, well, you're going to be arraigned at 1:30 on Monday. This is Friday afternoon. Okay, so we have 2 days to cover the protests. But also, I said, well, is this really just automatically going to happen? He said, yes, this is how it works. I said, there's no person who's going to, there's no pressure point here. There's nothing that's going to happen between now and then. He said, well, yeah, the judge signs off. It's absolute rubber stamp. He signs off on all of these, but the judge uses their discretion later in a trial or whatever. So wait a second, a judge is involved? He said, it's automatic. I said, no, this is the difference between us mere mortals and judges. They have discretion at every point. Lawyers, well, not really at... Give me the name of the judge, please. And so we put out a press release, and we said that this judge would be deciding on whether the charges would hold for me to be arraigned on Monday. And needless to say, it was getting a lot of attention, right? A reporter is about to be arrested. And we covered the protests over the weekend. On Monday morning, the show must go on, so we were in North Dakota, so we got a satellite truck from Minneapolis, and we broadcast in front of the Mandan courthouse and jail. And then after the show, I turned myself in. So we were on the church property across the street, and the backdrop was the courthouse, the jail, and the Ten Commandments in between. So we started the show. It was 7 in the morning, North Dakota time. I was interviewing Dave Archambault, the 45th tribal chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux. Like, President Trump is the 45th president of the United States. Dave Archambault. And I asked him, have you ever been arrested? And he said a few months ago, yes, in the civil disobedience, I was arrested. He said it was my first time, a low-level misdemeanor charge. And I said, and what happened? And so he said, I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. Low-level misdemeanor. Then I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician of the reservation. She cares about the children's health. And she was one of the first to be arrested. Low-level civil disobedience misdemeanor. And I said to her, what happened? And she said, I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. I mean, the humiliation of a people. I was at one point at one of the airports in Bismarck, and a guy came up to me. I was reading a magazine or something, and he said, don't think I don't know who you are. And I said, oh, really? Well, who are you? And he said, I was one of the guards at the site on Labor Day weekend. I said, oh, really? Did you unleash the attack dogs? He said, no. He said there were several companies that were employed by the Dakota Access Pipeline. We did not know this other company had dogs. We were as shocked as anyone was. And he said, you don't think I get it? We sick attack dogs on them after massacring them for hundreds of years. I understand why they're angry. Again, never assume someone's position based on their position. So we did the show. Where now the hours are turning toward 1:30. Hundreds of Native Americans are coming to perform ceremonies, show their support. Police are lining up across the street. We're counting down to 1:30. All the media is now covering this. I mean, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, homepage of the BBC, internationally, Al Jazeera, Vogue magazine. I have to spiff up my act. And I get a call from a host at North Dakota Public Radio right before 1:30, and he says, the judge isn't going to sign off on the charges. You're not going to be arraigned today. He knew all the players for decades. And as we were interviewing people there, we saw that a number of Native Americans who were facing felony and misdemeanor charges that day also had their charges dropped. This is the power of the media spotlight when it is shined in the right direction. I am all for reality television. Just not the kind Donald Trump stars in or they present on television, but the actual media that shows the reality of people's lives on the ground. And I will just end by saying, our first book was called Exception to the Rulers, and that should be the motto of all the media. We are the exception to the rulers. The second book was called Static. And the reason we called it that is in this high-tech digital age with high-def television and digital radio, all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Democracy Now!
You've been listening to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. Don't forget that you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.